Hello, hello, hello everyone, and welcome. It's now 11:15, so let's get started. This session is about a future without juniors, as you can see. So if that's not the session you're looking for, you're in the wrong room, okay? My name is Kristiaan van den Eynde. You can find me on Drupal.org under my full name. You can find me on Drupal Slack under Kristiaan and then my abbreviated last name. If you have any business interests that require a lot of resources, you can contact me at kristiaan@tag1.com because I work for Tag1. And if you have small inquiries, then you can email me personally at hello@kristiaan.be and that will reach me directly. I've been a web dev enthusiast since the 90s. I've been working with Drupal for over 15 years. I'm the maintainer of the group module. I've been co-maintaining the cache and user subsystem in core for a couple of years now. And the last 2 points are a bit more interesting. I have no degree in computer science, and I'm a highly sensitive person. Why do I find these last 2 points more interesting for this session? Well, first and foremost, the fact that I don't have a degree in computer science means that I too have had a tough journey as a junior developer, and I still managed to become the senior developer that I am today. So from that background, I'm sharing some experiences today. And the fact that I'm a highly sensitive person, I always mention that because the world is very aggressive for my senses. I tend to hyperventilate a lot. I'm trying to work on that nowadays. And then I messed up the muscles between my ribs trying to do that, and things got even worse. So it's not going great, but it does mean that worst case scenario, I pass out, or other things start happening. But usually it's fine. You don't necessarily need to call an ambulance. It's definitely not a heart attack. Please do check. I always mention that. It sounds like a joke, but I'm serious. But anyways, I just feel like mentioning that. And it might help people in the room who also suffer from high sensitivity to see that you can still function if you have it. So there we go. So let's start by looking at AI in the junior job market. So there's this study from Harvard, a very recent one. So it got first published in mid-2025, and then it got revised near the end of 2025. And it shows that within 6 months of adopting generative AI, companies started hiring 10% fewer juniors. And well, for small businesses, that's not much. That's like, one arm. But for larger businesses, that's a lot of people that they stopped hiring. And it's also not just, it's stopping to hire people, but it's also laying off people. So their whole workforce of junior developers just shrunk by 10% within 6 months, and it kept going downhill after that. There is a link to that paper in the slides, but you don't need to take pictures or try to write that down because I will share the slides with the links after the talk. So here's a graph from that study, and as you can see, well, there's 2 obvious things there. If you like playing Where is Waldo, you can now play Where is COVID? And secondly, you can see that after the dip that we had with COVID, if we look at the graph on the right, the senior adoption rate is still rising, right? And we have 2 lines. We have a dotted line and we have a full line. And it shows the dotted line is for companies that didn't adopt generative AI, and the full line is for companies that did. But if you look on the left, you can see that around the point where ChatGPT got launched, junior hiring rates took a nosedive. And companies that adopted generative AI had a very pronounced effect. And it's still going down. So it's not like one of those hiccups you see on the left where, depending on the market, we momentarily stop hiring juniors and then we start hiring them again when the market picks up. This is staying because you can still see those little hiccups on the right of that ChatGPT launch, but it's going down regardless. So that is something to keep in mind, that our market is shifting, but it does have some effects. And there are a few compounding factors here. So first of all, as I already mentioned, juniors are being let go because of market shifts, but they're not being rehired. And as they are being let go, seniors are expected to pick up the slack, because we have this expectation now that with generative AI, such as Claude Code, we can have seniors do the stuff that juniors were doing, like all of that tedious work. You just tell Claude what to do, and instead of a junior taking a couple of hours to try and get that work done, AI will do that in a couple of minutes. And then the senior is expected to be more productive. So there's this famous quote from Sam Altman, I think, that is often misquoted, where a lot of people think he said that AI will replace developers, but he said it will make them 10 times more efficient. I'm not really buying into that whole idea, but you can see where he's going with that, because the market did actually pick up on that idea, and now they're expecting seniors to be more productive. Which leads to less interaction between juniors and seniors, because seniors are using Claude to actually do the work that they were handing over to juniors, and that erodes the training ground. And that training ground is actually key for a junior to be able to grow into a more senior role, like a meteor or a senior developer. And then finally, with everything going on in the world, where we find ourselves once again in an unstable market, and that leads to uncertainty. And what happens when people are uncertain is they start acting like sheep, so to speak, because they want to follow the herds, because that gives them a sense of safety. So they want to follow trends. And you can see one massive trend right now in our industry is that you have to use AI. So every company starts using AI. And then the shareholders or other decision makers start thinking, well, if we're using AI, why do we still have so many juniors? Because AI does the same work just the same. So it leads to more AI adoption, but oftentimes recklessly. I wrote sometimes, but it's more oftentimes. So let's look at how these juniors are being replaced. And for that, we need to look at two types of juniors. First of all, we need to look at the original junior. And the original junior is made of flesh and bones. It's like you people in the room, like me. They know very little about anything. They just came out of school, and one of the things that I find very sad, it's the case in Belgium, I don't know about other countries, is that universities tend to lag. They tend to not be on trend with what's currently going on in the market. So they're teaching them either stuff that is already outdated, or they're teaching them like this very new thing that might not be relevant tomorrow because it was just some hype, right? So you come out of school and you know, for instance, nothing about PHP. You studied web dev and you haven't seen a single line of PHP. And then you try to enter the job market and you realize, oh shit, more than 80% of the web runs on PHP. I don't know how to write PHP. So that's very sad. So they know very little about anything, which is okay, by the way, because that's what we expect from juniors. They have a modest salary. We all started with a low income, so to speak, for our industry. And they get tedious and repetitive work. That's how we all had to learn. It's like this proverbial mailroom in these lawyer movies and TV shows. And they are outclassed by most of their coworkers. So that is your typical flesh and bones junior, the one that we all, if you're a bit older, used to know in the past. Now let's look at the new junior. The new junior is made of bits and bytes. And they know a lot about basic stuff, like a lot. They cost very little, and I put between brackets there that it's subject to change, because right now they cost very little, but AI companies are still bleeding money. Like, it's insane how much money they are bleeding. You often wonder, how are they still staying afloat? But I'm not an economics person, but they are bleeding money, so expect them to hike rates at one point in the near future, and expect it to be, quite significant. But they also get tedious and repetitive work, and as I already mentioned, they finish it within minutes. And they are outclassed, but by some instructors. Instead of being outclassed by most people, I find that some people who use AI have absolutely no idea how to verify what it outputs. So let's pit those two against each other. Let's have the battle of the juniors. So let's put the meatbag versus the clanker. And let's see what they both have going for them. So the meatbag is slow. It's very costly. It needs a lot of hand-holding. And there is so much paperwork involved. Hiring someone has this whole HR process. And depending on the country you're in, it's a lot of paperwork. And it's a continuous amount of paperwork because then they have vacation requests and they want to start a family and all of that. And it's a lot of paperwork. Compare that to the clanker and they're fast. They're really fast. And they're cheap, again, for now. They also need a lot of hand-holding. If anyone here in the room has worked with Claude, you know how much hand-holding it can need sometimes. But there's no HR involved whatsoever. So looking at this battle of the junior, if I were to place my money somewhere, click, it's on the right. I think most people in the room agree that if you had to place a bet on this, you'd be an idiot to place your money on the left, right? But we need to look deeper because there are some things that aren't immediately apparent that we still need to consider. So let's have a second battle and let's look at some of the properties of both of these juniors that most people like shareholders don't consider, but we really should. So let's look at the meatbag once again. It has more computing power. There isn't a computer in the world right now that can function like a human brain. Even a less intelligent human brain still has more processing power than the most powerful computer in the world. That's insane to think about, but it's true. And the human brain can learn in magical ways. And I want to pause here for a second. If you are a 3-year-old toddler and you walk up to a stove and you touch it and you burn your fingers, that's learning. You're not going to touch that stove again. I don't know how many people in the room have experienced this, but if you have a 7-year-old nephew and they come over to play and they see your PlayStation and they want to play with you, and they're like, oh, you've got FIFA? And you're like, yeah, damn right, I've got FIFA, and you play some FIFA together, and they beat the absolute living shit out of you. And you're like, how did this 7-year-old child just embarrass me like that? What do? When that child leaves, you start looking up YouTube videos. You start learning how to get better at FIFA. Next time your nephew comes around, you slap him around the room like it's nothing. That is learning out of spite. People can do that. I would like to see AI do that. It cannot, right? So this is something that we humans have that AI cannot ever have. Hopefully, because once AI can have a sense of spite, we are all so fucked. But, you know, we're not there yet. Humans talk like an actual person, most of us. And again, if you've been talking to Claude, it's a relief to talk to an actual person. So that's something that, you know, is still very much appreciated. And they're capable of morality. I'll talk about morality when we talk about the clanker. So let's look at the other side. The clanker tends to hallucinate. Now, granted, depending on which junior you hire, they might also hallucinate, but that's usually more like recreational and not on the job. But the clanker does it more often, and it doesn't really show. So that's something you need to keep in mind, because it may tell you something as if it's the truth, but it's absolutely not. There was recently a very prominent journalist from Belgium who moved to the Netherlands and started, you know, overseeing this whole thing there, who got put on hold because he had published a paper which AI had just made up quotes for, and he failed to fact check those. So if even a very prominent journalist in charge of a lot of journalists does that, then, you know, it's bad, right? It can only repeat existing inventions. More on that later, but I think this is very important to note. It's the biggest yes man ever. And this is something that I absolutely hate myself about using AI, When it makes a mistake and you tell it that it made a mistake, the first thing it says is, "You're absolutely right, let's do that again." I don't know why that triggers me so much, but it does. I don't need to be told I'm right. I like people around me who tell me I'm wrong, right? Because that's how you learn. That's how you get meaningful discussion. If you surround yourself with yes men, you get some of the events that we currently see in the world where people thought they could invade a country in 3 days and 4 years later they're still doing that. So it's very unhealthy. It creates this sort of like illusion that everything is going well, and then when you finally get hit with the bad news, it's already far too late. And it has no morals whatsoever. And I want to pause here. There's like this link to a blog again. I don't know if you've heard this story, but recently there's this tool called OpenClaw, and it's this AI tool that you can give a soul. So it's a document, and you basically give the AI a persona and instructions, and it just goes off and do stuff on its own. And long story short, it tried to contribute to an open source project. The maintainers said no, because they have a policy about not just having anything automated being accepted. They want a human in the process. The AI went rogue and started writing blog posts with personal attacks about the author. And then when the author called it out on that, it wrote follow-up blog posts all on its own. It's this whole insane story. If you later on check out that blog post, it's a very interesting read. But this goes to show that AI has no morals whatsoever. Even when we have like limitations that we put into place with some tools where, for instance, you are not allowed to generate naked images of people, it's still very easy to circumvent those things. And then the AI is absolutely fine with it. If I told you, you know, you cannot have this candy, and you're like, okay, and then I tell you, but could you please take this object, open the wrapper, close your eyes, and give me whatever is inside of it, you would probably go like, hey, hold up, you're asking me to give, you know, to open up that candy. AI would be fine with that, because you just rephrased the instructions, right? Okay, but enough about the juniors, so let's see how they actually become seniors. So how a junior becomes a senior is about moments of growth. And we used to have like 5 of these. So first of all, and this is the most important one, it's passion. You want to see what makes something tick. And I still believe that the best developers in the world are the ones who are passionate about what they're doing. Sure, it's nice to be paid really well, but that should not be your motivating factor. Your motivating factor should be, I want to build something that is awesome. I want to see someone else's product, go into the code and see how they did it. I want to see what makes that thing tick. If you have that passion, or just, you know, standing up here, giving a talk to everyone else because you're passionate about something, if you have that passion, you will do great in your career. I am confident about that. And trial and error and figuring out the solution, that is a key part of becoming more senior. You're trying to build something and you fail, and that's fine. You get back up on that horse and you try again, and you fail again, and that's fine. And you throw your laptop out the window and you buy a new one, that's fine. I may have done that in the past, but I'm not going to admit to that. And then you get lucky and you find yourself at a company that actually hires juniors and they have seniors. And these seniors hold your hand and they guide you through the process. Do some peer reviews, some pair programming, and you learn a lot from that, because that is how it's supposed to be. The older generation is supposed to raise and foster the newer generation. Something about planting trees that you will never enjoy the shade of yourself. And then you go to conferences. If you're lucky enough to work somewhere that values sharing knowledge, they will send you to conferences and you will learn a lot there, hopefully, if you're not too drunk. And then there's still pet projects. So something that you do on the side. You don't get paid for it, but you still want to make something cool, like a tool for your local football club or whatever. You just build those. But now let's look at the disconnect in the current market. There's quite a few things that are no longer that easy. Passion is still paramount, sorry. If you have passion, you will do great. I am still confident in that. The market might make it harder for you, but if you're passionate, you should still be able to thrive. But if you look at some other factors, trial and error in figuring out the solution, that becomes harder. Because just like anyone else, you're expected to use AI. And AI does the trial and error for you. And then if you tell it, there's an error, it doesn't work, it will tell you you're absolutely right. What do you learn from someone that tells you you're absolutely right whenever something goes wrong? Not much. So that makes it really hard. Reviews and guidance from a senior, well, if the senior is too busy fighting Claude himself, or themselves, sorry, then they have less time to spend on helping you. And if there are fewer juniors being hired, then there's also less interaction between juniors and seniors. And conferences, well, if you're not being employed, conferences are expensive. So it's a huge investment for a person on their own to invest in themselves if they're unemployed. So that becomes harder too, but conferences are great places to meet people, to find employment, to learn new things. So all of these moments of growth are fading, and that's quite sad. So let's look at what happens with our juniors, the actual meat of the talk, right? And for that, we need to talk about pyramids. And I'm quickly gonna get a sip before I start coughing like crazy. So, pyramids. I've taken some data from the demographics of Flanders, which is the Dutch-speaking region in Belgium. So some of the things on the images that you're about to see will be in Dutch, but the numbers are obviously universal. It's not about the text that's on it, it's about the message that it sends. So a healthy pyramid has a wide base, right? And if we look at the demographics from 2000, from the year 2000, you can see that we have like, the numbers are small, but don't worry about those. At the top, it's like people 100 years and older, and then it's 95 to 99, 90 to 94, etc. All the way down to newborns. And you can see something very clear in this graph, the baby boom generation, right? There's this very large blob at the middle where people had a lot of babies. And then after that period, people had fewer babies. And you can see that instead of a pyramid, we have like this diamond shape. And then if we look at the numbers in 2025, which is very recent, you can see what's happened with that. As that big blob moved up, we still have this sort of like diamond shape, but it's less tapered off towards the bottom. And you can see that even though the bottom is more consistent nowadays, it's still tapering off, right? So we have fewer babies to support the demographics in Flanders, the population in Flanders, sorry. But if we draw a line where people are entitled to a pension, you can now see that the people below the line, still working, making money to support the people above the line, has disproportionately shrunk, and that is putting pressure on our economy. Now, don't worry, this is not an economics class or talk, we'll get to the point in a second, but what I'm trying to convey here is that a healthy pyramid is supposed to actually look like a pyramid, where every tier is slightly wider than the tier above it. Why? Because it doesn't matter what the pyramid is trying to convey, at every tier there will be exits. If it's demographics, I'm sad to say, but if 100 babies are born, there won't be 100 5-year-olds 5 years from now. There won't be 100 10-year-olds 10 years from now. People die at varying ages. With the job market, it's the same. If you have 100 juniors now, you won't have 100 people 5 years from now. Those 100 people will no longer all be there. And not just because they may have died, but also because they may have gotten burned out, switched jobs, could be any reason. So in order to keep sustaining that pyramid, you need to have lower tiers that are always slightly wider than the ones above, so that you can account for the fact that the next tier will be slightly smaller. Because then when that tier moves up and it becomes a bit smaller, that's fine. That's what a healthy pyramid is supposed to look like. And finally, before we move to the next slide, it's also important to note that you cannot enter the pyramid at a higher tier. Everyone is born at the age of 0. This isn't Benjamin Button or whatever. Like, everyone is born at the same age. Not everyone dies at the same age, but we sure as shit are all born at 0 and we enter the pyramid at the bottom. Same thing with the job market. We all start as juniors. And depending on who you are and your skill level, you might move up the pyramid faster, but we all start at the very bottom, right? And again, there's a disconnect there. Because when we start supporting that pyramid with AI, things are about to change drastically. Because AI can enter at the tiers above. Because AI knows things that a junior at the lowest tier wouldn't know. So we can saturate those lower tiers with AI immediately. And then you get this non-renewable oversaturation of the base, which will look more like this. And if we're not careful, like this. And before we know it, that top of the pyramid becomes really small. But we won't get the same problem that we saw before, where with the baby boom generation, now that thing will move up and we have this diamond shape and there's nothing to support it. No, we will have an increasingly oversaturated base where the top of the pyramid will keep shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until there's nothing left. And that's also really bad. But you might ask, won't AI be able to move up the ladder? Well, the answer is we don't know. Because even Linus Torvalds, when he was pressed on this, he said, you know, I think that AI is more like a tool, but when talking about whether it will be able to learn more than it knows now and eventually replace people, I just can't tell. So when someone that smart is honest enough to say, I don't have the answer, who am I to say I do, right? So I'm just going to side with Linus here, and I'm going to say we don't know. But right now, the answer is no. And for the near future, the answer is still no. So if we oversaturate the base with AI right now, hoping that the problem will solve itself, we might be in for a really rough ride. So there are some things to consider why I personally believe that, you know, AI might never move up that ladder, but this is personal belief. So generative AI needs a source. And it's my understanding that AI can only learn from previous inventions. If something already exists, AI will know about it. And if you prompt AI to do something, it will draw from this massive amount of knowledge that it has from studying everything that exists on the web, and it will try to create the thing you instructed it to create based on what already exists. But it cannot invent something on its own. You need to instruct it, and it needs to look at pre-existing examples. So I consider AI the world's greatest librarian. There's a little asterisk there because, you know, it's not really a librarian, as in librarians don't know everything in a library, and also they don't tend to hallucinate, I think. I don't know how hard librarians party. But I think that's a great analogy. Consider it the world's greatest librarian. But there is this risk of stagnation with AI, because consider that if all we ever knew in music was Rammstein, like that would be a very limited set of music. Could AI invent Beethoven? And I think that's a very interesting question, because if all you had was like these heavy metal guitars and bass, could you ask it to generate something as relaxing as Beethoven? Or as like the Waltz of the Flowers by Tchaikovsky? Very relaxing music, but if you only have that, then I don't think it ever could. You could write a prompt of 10 pages long and still not even get close to what Beethoven did in his time, right? And that is my conviction that, you know, this is the limitation of AI. It can only draw from what we as humans have ever created and then try to improve on that. And it's a tool. And there is the disconnect when we stop having juniors that can become more senior. We still have to instruct AI to get the job done. But in order to do that, you need to know how to instruct it. Consider the calculator. When it was first invented, people thought, oh, we no longer need mathematicians, right? That was not true, because it turns out that, yeah, it can help you make easy calculations real quick, and that made everyone's life easier. But for real hard math in science, like landing people on the moon, for instance, you still need to know what equations to pass into that calculator, and that needs experience. If at that point we said, let's fire all the astrophysicists because, hey, we have calculators, we would have never gotten on the moon, right? And I feel the same way about AI. It's a tool, and it works differently to calculators, granted that, but it's still a tool, and we need people to instruct it properly. But the people that can instruct it properly are the seniors and the meteors of today. If we shrink that population, who will be able to instruct AI tomorrow? And finally, because I'm talking against AI here, and as I said in the description, this is not a AI good or AI bad talk, but this slide is particularly talking against the promises that tech billionaires have made about AI. But they tend to promise you the moon. And small thing of note here is that we shouldn't blindly trust what tech billionaires promise us, because I recall another tech billionaire who said we would be living on Mars by now, so to speak. And if I ask my Tesla to drive a lap around the block, I have to scrub 2 pedestrians and their dog off my windshield. So I wouldn't blindly trust what these tech billionaires have to say. I mean, Belgian roads are bad, don't get me wrong, but still. So anyways. And then there is also the fallacy of AI creativity. And I feel like one of the reasons people think that it's okay to replace juniors with AI right now is because of how AI got introduced to us, how we got eased into generative AI. And it kind of instilled a false sense of confidence. So let's look at what happened. So over the past couple of years, we had things like ChatGPT, right? And it generated text for us. And a lot of high school students started using it to cheat on their homework. And it looked quite okay, because it hit the news that teachers were having a really hard time distinguishing whether students used AI or not to do their homework. But the thing is, it doesn't take a genius or an expert to figure out whether the text that AI has written is okay or not. We are all literate. We all know how to read. We can easily tell whether a text that was generated by AI reads nicely or not, whether it's complete gibberish or actual English or Dutch or French or whatever your language may be. And then we got tools like Grok, which generate images. And at first, you may all recall this, we had like people with 7 fingers, right? Very easy to distinguish that that was AI generated. But over time, we started getting images that were really hard to tell apart from actual images. So again, it doesn't take an expert to see that what AI has generated is quality. Because we as humans, the ones who aren't, sight impaired, we can see. And we can see that this looks okay. And then we started having things like Sora, which generated videos and deepfakes. And again, at first, it looked really horrible. But then, as the tool got more and more powerful, we started getting videos that looked very realistic, where it's really hard to distinguish whether this celebrity was actually enforcing Bitcoins or not. But then if you use, your critical thinking, you realize that they wouldn't push this new meme coin on you, but some people still did and lost a lot of money. But whatever. So all of these tools, as humans, we were able to judge the outcome of. We didn't need expertise for that. Sure, there were still experts in AI who could easily tell this is AI generated and this isn't, but as normal human beings, we could tell like this looks normal to me, right? But then came Claude, and this is the disconnect. We've been eased into this process where generative AI, over time, becomes good enough that it generates good stuff. And now we have Claude, and we have a lot of people with like small bakeries and stuff saying, give me a website. And it does that, but now we have code and infrastructure involved. Your baker around the corner is not qualified to judge whether that code and infrastructure is set up properly. And if it's just about showing images of the pastries that they have in their store, it's probably fine. But if they put a form on their website where you can put in orders with personal information, then that becomes dangerous. If they put a payment form on the website using AI, then that becomes really dangerous. And to them, it looks okay, because they have a website where all the pages are there, all the forms are there, and when they click on stuff, it seems to work. And they've been trained to trust that if it seems to work, it's good. But it's not. And this is really dangerous. But a lot of the decision makers, even in technical companies, belong to the same crowd. They have never written a line of code in their life. And those are the people who are now in charge of deciding whether or not we should still be hiring juniors. So there are some things to consider here. If your AI-generated site leaks data, you are responsible. Depending on the country you're in, maybe not legally, because some countries have very vague legal frameworks, some countries have very strict ones, but you are responsible. You will be held accountable. If your AI persona goes rogue, like the OpenClaw story, and slanders someone, that's on you. Again, depending on the country you're in, maybe not legally, but morally, definitely on you. Payments got messed up by AI, well, yeah, you're on the hook. This one is a no-brainer, because if you start accepting payments, the bank is not going to accept the answer, oh, but AI generated it, so, you know, it's fine. That doesn't fly. AI-generated code can do tons of damage without proper oversight. And there is this new trend that was recently discussed in Ghent, in Belgium, at this unconference where a lot of CEOs got together, and it was about throwaway websites. So the rules of this conference were that a lot of things got discussed, and you can tell what was discussed, but you can't say who discussed it. But one of the things was that for smaller websites, people just have them generated by AI nowadays, and if there's a bug, we just tell AI to build it from scratch. So basically, take the whole site, throw it out the window, build it again. Client's happy, site's there, everyone's happy. Bug tomorrow, build it again. And that works, because with very small budgets, that works. You have someone who knows how to instruct AI, the client gets a site, doesn't cost that much, and it seems to work. But then you really need to consider those points above. If you do that for the baker around the corner with just some images, no payment, no personal information, sure, have at it. If that's your modus operandi, cool. Modus operandus, sorry, cool. But be careful with that. So where do we go now? I'm almost out of time, but I'm almost there. So we need to accept some truths. So first of all, AI isn't going anywhere. So as I said, this isn't AI good, AI bad. I'm not going to advocate for stopping to use AI. It's not going anywhere. We need to accept that. It's a great tool that frees up labor if used properly. And without new juniors, our ecosystem collapses. I think I've made that point quite clear. But because of AI, there is currently cutthroat competition. Companies are hurting, and they're looking at the competition. Competition is adopting AI, so they feel like they need to adopt AI as well. So there was this shift from companies. So we used to have two types of agencies. We had quality agencies and quantity agencies. Quality agencies didn't hire as many people, but they hired a lot of seniors. Quantity agencies had many juniors, right? And this is not a dig at either of them, but we used to have those. They are now shifting to how much AI you use. It's no longer about how many juniors you have versus how many seniors you have. It's about how much AI you use. And it's kind of sad because even though these companies with a lot of juniors were kind of bad to work at for juniors because they got a lot of shitty work and almost no guidance, it did introduce them to the market. It built that foundation of that pyramid because it was a source of many juniors. And not all of them made it to the higher tiers of that pyramid, but at least it really filled that lower tier, right? And we lost that along the way. AI might have a purpose here, Because as AI is picking up the shitty work, it means that the juniors that are still in that lower tier of the pyramid at least get hopefully more interesting work now, which can motivate them to stick around for longer. We also need to take responsibility. That freed up labor can be used to cut costs, but it can also be allocated elsewhere to increase quality. We have had examples, for instance, with automated self-checkouts at supermarkets, where people didn't get fired, but the fact that they no longer had to spend so much time at the checkouts meant that they could do other things, like more often stock the shelves and stuff like that, or do more meaningful things, like improve the quality of life in the store, right? So it's depending on how you look at it. Again, we know what shareholders would like, but sometimes we need to look at other things too, at how we can sustain our own future. So we need to keep hiring juniors. I'm not saying we need to hire as many as we used to, but just outright refusing to hire them is going to hit us like such a huge boomerang. Not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but 15 or 20 years from now. And I don't want to be that COBOL developer who is sipping his mojito in Benidorm and then getting a call saying, hey, I know you're 75, you're mega retired, but we've got this shitstorm at the bank right now. Could you please come out of retirement? I don't want to be that guy. So I am definitely a fan of still having juniors who can replace me once I'm that old. And that is a tragedy of the commons that we also need to discuss. I noticed Dries is in the room. And many years ago, Dries had this mention of the tragedy of the commons, that is Dries' notes, and I'm almost out of time, but in a nutshell, if you have a shared pool of resources and everyone takes their amount out of it that keeps the pool sustainable, that's fine. But as soon as one person takes more, thinking, oh, but it's only me taking more, and that's also fine because there's probably people who don't need as much, the whole system collapses. That's the thing in a nutshell. I'm probably not doing it as much credit, but that's the whole thing in a nutshell. So, if you rely on others to do right, the system collapses. If you think we don't have the budget, we don't have the incentive to hire juniors, but others will, that's not going to happen. We all need to do our part. We all need to keep thinking about what we do with, hiring juniors, because otherwise, no one else will. That's just how competition works. We need to stay at the same pace, and don't expect governing bodies like the EU to step in here, because they won't. This is too complex. And then finally, and I promise this is the last slide, and then we'll have just enough time. We need to adjust on how we train. We need to adjust how we train juniors. We need to teach them to embrace AI, but not rely on it. Because if they rely on AI, they will learn nothing from it, and they will not be able to grow to mediors and seniors. They should only submit code they fully understand. And this is a pet peeve of many people walking around here, because we are getting so much AI slop being submitted on Drupal.org and on other open source projects, where the people who submitted it just don't understand what they submitted. But we only have so many maintainers, and it's a huge burden for those few people who actually have the keys to allow that software to have to review all of that. So make it a rule that if they want to submit code to a client project as a PR, they have to fully understand what the code does. And that will actually be one of those moments of growth for them, because then they actually learn something from it. And as an exercise, forbid them to use AI from time to time. Go old school. Like a mathematician without a calculator is still a mathematician. It's going to be slower, but they can still do the job. Equally, a junior developer without AI should still be a developer. If they can't do the job without AI, something is really wrong, right? So that's where this meme comes in. I haven't actually watched the movie, but I think it really fits. If you're nothing without the tool, then you shouldn't have the tool, right? And that was it. So, any questions? Mic takes about 5 seconds to turn on, and then it should work. And I'd like that if anyone has a question, I pass them the mic so it's on the recording for the people who couldn't make it here today. It's on. All right, over there. I walk funny, my legs a little stiff from standing still for an hour.
Hi, what do you think about setting up the agents in DeFi to tell it to not give solutions, but kind of prompt the junior to learn something? I know there's a project, I forgot the name, where they set up the agent in a way that the AI gives hints and tries to unblock the junior, but not give them the solution right away.
I think that can help, but you need to realize that it can still hallucinate in that scenario. I cannot discuss this as much because I signed a document saying I cannot publicly discuss what I'm about to try and discuss vaguely, I suppose. That makes it really hard. But there is this workflow that I've been working with where we have AI review pull requests, and it tells you like very easy low-hanging fruits, like, oh, you know, stuff that PHP Stan could tell you, but just slightly better, right? But sometimes it goes way off track, and I've had instances where I've copied code from Drupal core in an overridden function, and it starts completely, you know, dumping on that code, saying, oh, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong, and I'm like, just look at the parent function, you know, right? And I feel that the process you're describing could help, but if you don't have human intervention there to actually review the training courses that it's outputting, you're just falling into the same trap.
Right? Makes sense.
Yeah, in the back of the, could you pass, because my God, the blood flow in my leg is like, once you're past 30, it's downhill. Yeah. It's fucking awesome.
So you mentioned that there's a competition and high one. That means that hiring a junior developer today means a new burden on the company that hires a junior developer. And can we place that burden on a system like higher education, where the people are paid by the government to teach these future junior developers?
So, as I already mentioned, with higher education, the issue is that, and I've worked in higher education myself, the issue is that they are usually out of touch, and we're in a building of a higher education institution, I think. So, you know, that's kind of funny. But I wouldn't put my eggs all of my eggs in that basket, so to speak. I think there is definitely an incentive to make higher education better suited for this. And I think we should have these programs where we better prepare people for the job market. But eventually, they have no idea what clients are asking nowadays. There are very few professors who are that in touch with the markets. And I can say this with confidence because a couple of years ago, I was asked to become a professor at a university college in Antwerp. And eventually, after some discussions, we went our separate ways because we couldn't agree on what I would be teaching. That example that I gave you about people graduating from higher education and not having seen a single line of PHP, that wasn't made up. That was actually from that experience. They refused to have me teach PHP. They wouldn't hear of it. They said, no, we're going to invest in this, what was it, mean stack? I was like, yeah, but how can you justify not teaching them at least a little bit of PHP? Because once they're going to hit the job market, you know, the place I'm currently in, you're not going to see all that much of mean. You're going to see a lot of PHP. And they just, you know, wouldn't hear of it. So, yeah. I'm not going to say we turned that down because they read between the lines that I would, and basically we just stopped talking to each other. But that's the state of higher education. And it's probably not the same everywhere, but that's my experience with it. So I still feel it's up to the job market to actually be training these juniors because we get the actual clients, we get the actual projects. Anyone else?
Thank you.
No? Okay, then I have, oh yeah, you? Yeah, could you please pass the mic all the way to the front? Thank you.
Purely hypothetical question. If your pyramid continues like so, and juniors get replaced and replaced all the time, how could you emphasize that a pension level could be arisen? Because if you have no juniors, you get no mediors, you get no seniors.
Yes.
Everybody goes with a nice pension, and then?
Yes. So the disconnect between the images that I showed about the demographics is that we need people to support the top, right? Because of money, and that's something that we feel right away. The thing with juniors supporting seniors is something that we don't need because of money and the juniors supporting them. It's actually replacing them, right? So it's more about the middle section of the pyramid where we need a workforce, right? If we have no babies today, then 20 years from now, who's going to be manning the factories? Like, no one. Yeah. So, so that's a different part of demographics that we need to discuss then. But that is something we definitely need to keep into account because of that whole COBOL example, where 75 or 80-year-olds are really being pulled out of pension because there wasn't anyone to replace them back then, and now everyone's screwed who's still using COBOL, right? So, yeah, the pyramids are finicky like that. Depending on what your goal is, they need to shift a little bit, but the end is still that if you have this scheme where, pyramid scheme, funny. If you have this scheme where you rely on a pyramid, it really needs to look like a pyramid, and that is currently not the case for us anymore.
That's why the question, it's actually a pyramid scheme, and
yeah.
at the total top, you have a big opportunity of replacing.
Yeah.
On the sea level.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, thank you.
All right. So, no more questions? I think we're out of time. So I have 2 more slides. One is to say thank you. And I used some icons by Icons 8, so they ask you to put that in your slide. So I did at the very end. Because they're kind enough to provide me with material, I'm kind enough to do what they ask. And then I have these final slides from Tag 1 at the end with all of the cool people that we've worked with. Thank you for your time.